I'm Ryan O'Dowd, and you're listening to Ryan's Audiobooks on the Issues Magazine YouTube channel. Today I'm going to continue with section 415 of The Omega Seed, Paolo Soleri. Moving on in Book 5, Sacred Spaces, Chapter, Architecture as Information. Instant Societies and Durational Societies. At this point, it is necessary to understand that interiorization is a duration process, which is why there is an intrinsic fault in the concept of instant societies made up of instant things to use instantly and throw away. Consumerism is possibly not the best characterization of an ethos that is really more sympathetic toward throwaway than consumption. Consumption characterizes a process of wearing to the bone, or at least thread, of a specific thing, tool, or garment, container, or content. Kleenex, the instant handkerchief, stands as a simple but clear symbol of the throwaway society. Kleenex, stored in the box, can find its way to the garbage heap by the instant intermediary of a nose blow. But interiorization is a process which cannot occur in short flashes surrounded by the blackness and bleakness of naught. Therefore, when the assimilative, transformative process dwindles into a game of warehousing raw data in the brain, real growth becomes impossible. As it takes a certain amount of biological time to transform bread into flesh, so it takes a definitive psychosomatic time to perceive, digest, and make knowledge out of environmental input. The instant thing, whatever it is below the threshold of interiorization. It simply bounces against and away from the sphere of the self, which under such bombardment will slowly wither into the stone of ego. It is indeed one of the potential assets of an informative environment, this offering to the self of more and better elements for self-transcendence. It is in the environment that the self finds pleasure and the enticement to reach further and further, to appropriate, acknowledge, and finally interiorize ever larger spheres of reality. By this process, the territory of the self can extend to the border of the man-made environment, the city, for instance. But, and here a whole new connection between matter and spirit enters into play, since it is a territory of knowledge it sees as unnecessary, indeed burdensome, physically holding or owning that which is in fact his or hers, inasmuch as it has been perceived, grasped, understood, and made into knowledge. At such point, when ownership becomes a burden, the authority of knowledge, which should be the only legitimate authority, can have an edge upon power, which most of the time is, covertly or not, the naked force made available to the most aggressive, cunning, and greedy, the possessive. Knowledge and ownership. This is the reason why the real power of information knowledge in the long run will give the lie to most of the notions relating to the territorial imperative in its appendix, the view that ownership is sanctioned by God and therefore is to be held as a sacred right of man. It would appear that on this score, man has stepped backward below the animal level. On the animal level, hoarding is seldom practiced and territoriality is more imagined by the scientist than enforced by the animal, since his territory is a field opened for all sorts of activities by other competitive species, vegetal and animal. It's a rush judgment, since it does not take into account that man, as the maker par excellence, has introduced into the world a whole new reality that can be divided into two parts. First, that part of the man-made which is so directly involved in the life and routine of the person as to be identified with it. It would be futile, for instance, if not stupid, to say that my shoes or my glasses do not belong to me. Second, the institutionalized life of those things which foster the development of Homo sapiens. The institutionalized life is anchored to and sheltered by the hardware it needs in order to perform, the largest and most comprehensive item being nothing else but the city itself, including its specific character at this or that industrial center, vacation center, etc. The question then arises, who and what is responsible for making and running this second part? Who will coordinate the institutions, the marketplace, the industrial plant, the library, the restaurant, the bank, the church, the school, and all the other complex machines for creation? One answer, not necessarily the best, is the person or group having a specific holding and hoarding of power. Private property might well belong in a series of intermediate steps between a world where the responsibility for the necessary institutions of society is consigned to the Father King, in a world where such responsibility becomes a more intrinsic part of the theo-ecological process, whose guiding track is purely and simply but sublimely difficult, the reverence for life. A totally reverential humankind would find it difficult to grasp the meaning of ownership, since there would be no meaning one could attach to it any longer other than a reminiscence binding needs, anxieties, fear, and insecurity to greed and intolerance. If this appears as a politicization of the question, it might be wise to remember that the polis is the place where the instrument of politics takes root, and that, for this reason, the policies that make for the running of the polis and the nation are idle. Whenever the three-dimensional, physical, gravity-loaded, and durationally real polis, the environmental polis of information learning, is in disrepair, or does squalidly buffer society from the aggression of climate, weather, functional breakdown, foreigners, enemies, and bureaucrats. Reverence and the pedagogy of the environment. On another occasion, I put the question of the environment this way. If we take care of our environment because such care is imposed by edict, the result might be order in appearance, death in substance. If we take care of only that portion of our environment which we own, the environment will be like a sea of litter and dread dotted with the small island utopias whose segregated order is the true origin of chaos. This is a pretty close description of the urban-suburban situation today. If we take care of the environment because we have a sense of reverence toward it, then the reverential fire will make the environment glow with the embers of the spirit. What makes this diversion pertinent to the environment as information is that once the environment is accepted as bona fide information and germinal knowledge, there still remains the issue of seeing that fraudulence is not introduced with the package. In general terms, one could contend that a direct consequence of a sanctified concept of private property is a pauperization of the environmental pedagogy. Under such narrow, untheological, and unecological constrictions, the environment becomes the locus where things are hoarded around increasingly withering selves at the expense of the person in society, to the point where the selves are not much more than petrified egos, and into the physical landscape of society is reduced the dread of suburbia. At such a stage, the environmental pedagogy reaches its lowest form. It becomes a fraudulent Arcadia, parasitically grafted to the dwindling resources of the earth. Knowledge and power. There's no way to overstate this unless we make knowledge a purely cunning instrument for self-assertion. Then we incur the unbreakable contradiction of knowledge becoming, as it has in all ages, the shelter for all sorts of falsehood, necessary to hold steady the machine of power. What we exhibit is what we are, and we exhibit poor knowledge by putting sacredness where it does not belong, in the holding power sanctioned by an ambiguous social contract. To say that, nevertheless, the dimness of suburbia contains the strong light of self-determination might be less true than convincing. Idolatries are powerfully fostered among the democracy, which has taken residence in suburbia. Not least are the legitimized idolatries ritualized in church parlors or drive-in temples, the idolatry of quiet greed which has crept through and around the illusion of an innocent or bland life. One reaction to environmental fraud is naturally, as pointed out above, the Woodstock knot and commune nostalgia which in crude ways the past condition and ideal of animal innocence is sought. The illusion is short-lived, and it ought not to bring regret or breastfeeding and sorrow, since we should be able to understand the natural man of today is a different creature from natural man or proto-man of the Garden of Eden, and therefore the pedagogic impact of neo-nature caused by man is different from the pedagogic impact of pristine nature surrounding, nurturing, and harassing Adam and Eve, attached now to the electronic breast of rock. If education is to make ourselves see, to be seers, then the physiological, perceptual functions of sight and sound and smell and touch are at least as important a part of the pedagogical process. The child is made to see by the parents and the teacher in long years of guidance. Or is it true to say that the blindness of parents and teachers is the gravest handicap that child runs into in his efforts as a potential seer? What is it that makes the squalid environment a punishing environment? Fundamentally, the power it has to force blindness and dumbness upon the individual who cannot escape it. It's a simple mechanism for survival, aided by the degenerative process of organs not used. We learn not to see and feel even when we look and hear. The psychological blindness-dumbness destroys the source of environmental information. The spring dries up since the retina and the ear have been disconnected from the mind. Blindness is endemic in a mesmerized society, condemned to live in cruelly bleak environs. The stark fact is that the physical environment, which for more and more people is becoming the urban-suburban environment, is, or should be, a powerful information knowledge source. It ought to be also an uplifting, engrossing asset for us, the people living in it, if it will perfect and foster an ethos which reverentially goes about the business of survival as if it were instead and indeed the true art of living. Knowledge and sacredness. To make an example, what has sometimes been called a temple of learning, the university, suffers ultimately from unwarranted limitations, since it is a walled-in machine for information. It is instead the city as the temple of life, or the civitas Dei, which has become the ultimate source of true knowledge. But this is a cryptic discourse unless we unabashedly acknowledge the sacred nature of the living and the not necessarily sacred nature of the learning process. By a not too long series of relays, one recognizes the theo-ecological imperative. This says that since ecological dynamics have brought the Earth from its dumb state, a fiery agglomeration of matter eons ago, into a body whose skin by man's mediation is in the process of taking conscious of itself. The whole ecological process is the pragmatic development of that sensitization, which is none other than the etherealization of matter into spirit. Why is this a sacramental phenomenon? Theoecology. Since sensitization is necessarily a phenomenon of sufferance, the sufferance of an experience attempting an ultimately compassionate exploit, to transform the natural into the loving, it has a sacramental thrust, which makes the ecological development a theological evolution. Then the places and spaces which are part and parcel of those dynamics become the business of sacredness. The good city is a sacred locus. It is the civitas Dei. It is that complex machine for information, which by the non-expedient ways of design also becomes knowledge in itself, where the media has finally, if only within limits, sublimated itself into the message, a large interiority reverentially turning to the handling of a particular sacri, the polis dwellers. This is the city as an open classroom, open to all ages, so as to let energies and wisdom make and cause life to be in ever stronger radiance. If the real conditions one finds in the city of today, any city, are a far cry from all of this, the discrepancy is to be seen as a gap between what ought to be and what is. On the other hand, note that the cityscape has established throughout history a sound record, indeed, the indispensable record of man's quest for the spirit. Nor is this idle talk. The best demonstration is the previously mentioned pilgrimage, uninterrupted and massive, of the cynical society of today to the remainder and still operative centers of the past. Man avidly seeks out of the bricks and stones that past with which man has labored. We will be the damnedest of fools if we forget that the force-fed information of some academics, the electronic included, has great and often damaging limitations. And if at the same time we go on ignoring the subtle and lasting way by which the environment constructed by man is, by its own nature, the most available and enviable tool, the true mass information and communication media message. If we care for it, the rewards will be clear and unequivocal. Not the least would be the reduction of urban violence and vandalism. Since ownership is a poor substitute for knowledge, it is in the optimum environment for learning where the resentment against those things that others hold and one is deprived of is destined to show its precariousness via precisely the perceived and felt precariousness of hoarding. From this acknowledgement to the metamorphosis of resentment vandalism into reverence, the path might be difficult, but it is, in any case, the only one man has access to. Technology and knowledge. Something should be said about the role or the intrusion of what goes under the name of technology in the environmental learning machine, the city. 1. Extrabiological technology, the technology of the man invented and man produced, finds its effectiveness in its innate bent towards oversimplification. Western technology owes its success to the analytical mind and to the innocent dogma that all things can be reduced to black and white terms. The result is a simple-minded ethos sustained by hordes of complicated equipment, each single-mindedly running its own metronomic life cycle for and against the master will. One of the things that disqualifies the technologist in city planning is this innate propensity for analysis and oversimplification. The person who can break down and investigate the pieces seldom has the capacity or interest to construct and synthesize, let alone to metamorphize. The combined results of technological oversimplifications point to an environment which at best appeals to the naked, psychosomatically blind, dumb, non-sensual mind, which is by training deprived of the durational dimension. It is the instant environment I am talking about, designed under the cloak of obsolescence. 2. If and when the technologies of logistics, transportation, delivery, and retrieval serving a system, an urban settlement, for instance, becomes too cumbersome, the system is surely sick. Servo-gigantism is a pathological condition. Therefore, beware, for instance, of the automobile mode. It's a killer. It's the killer of the city as a radiant information learning milieu. The servo systems must be self-effacing, so as to let society express itself. As they are now, the only expression we see is the brutal, squalid expression of a hopeless logistical mega-machine running man to distraction and destruction. If I seem to crave a romantic nostalgia, I'm given the wrong impression. I favor a more subtle technology, a self-effacing technology, in accordance with the psychosomatic laws of efficiency and harmony. Consider the human body and see how beautifully concealed is the fury of the physiological robot keeping up with the avalanche of things introduced by the improbable next moment. Consider then a car-ridden city and see the enormity of the logistical breakdown of our technology of information via integration. Not only is the individual isolated within his pollution machine, but the machine is the fulcrum of a whole series of divisive, brutalizing, wasteful, energy-burning, noisy, segregational objects, ranging from the Superloop to the 4 gas stations on a crossroad, from the endless parking lot to the endless ribbon of semi-parked cars on the traffic-jammed highway, etc. Since the aim is not to come up with aimlessly complicated hardware, but with the kind of hardware that facilitates a complex perception action, the complex environment only rarely coincides with the environment bulging with costly, complicated mechanisms and gadgetries. Fritz Lang's film Metropolis well illustrated the magnitude of a technological Frankenstein, monumentally bearing down on those specks of passion or spent passions called people. Self-effacing technology, the truly efficient technology, forcefully, if not automatically, signals good tidings and is in any case the necessary step toward the liberation of the spirit from the reservoirs of mass energy. Apollo Capsule and Knowledge. That is why, not contradictorily, we could look upon the Apollo capsule as the seed of a cathedral. It's a seed around which life has consciously and unequivocally, in this instance dogmatically, begun its journey into the extra-biological technology of complexification, after a long history of analysis simplification operating on and for the destiny of man. With the Apollo groping, the sacred, which is the conscious and the passionate, the complex, begins, even if involuntarily and only tangentially, to put down roots outside of itself, indeed, outside of this world and into the miniaturized hardware of the capsule. Capsule and man, if yet distinguishable, are not separable. Since the evolutionary mileage to be traveled is infinite in space-time terms, the Apollo capsule is almost totally deprived as yet of a rich and unpredictable environmental impact. It is a naked contraption for survival. But then, what was the new-formed Earth of a long time ago? It was a classroom stripped down to the bare geological bones, empty of pupils and teacher, a silent mass of media incapable as yet of any message. Anguish and knowledge. The environment which is capable of truly informing is that environment which has durational dimension. Durational dimension is sufferance dimension, the common human experience that ultimately what surrounds and contains us is beyond our grasp, as what makes us do and be what we are is beyond our grasp. This anxiety is the dimension of sufferance necessary for the conception and the construction of the places where we live. Without it, we simply disavow life and miss getting at the core of where splendor and darkness mingle. It also is the dimension that, when present, gives the environment that surcharge of information, which triggers the process of understanding and identification. The emotional impact that a landscape or cityscape has upon a person is a combination of the exhilaration of understanding and at the same time the anguish of realizing the massiveness of the unknown that such an environment makes tangible. Several coincidences comprise the magic of a good environment. It is this magic which breaks through the barrier of the thickest tide and forces a swelling of the ego, even if only for a few moments, into a matrix which transcends it into the self, and through the self breaks into the communion of universal consciousness. The lightning of perception and its moment of knowledge measures the length in durational beats, passed in constructing the magic of the instant. In different measures of intensity, all good environments operate transcendently on the ego, and therefore are information communication, knowledge, and recreation in one. In contrast, we can take the harshness of the Las Vegas Strip. Nothing there is willing to show us positive, either duration or the sufferance of process. It's purely a two-dimensional and fraudulent promise of an instant of happiness, an orphan's shout into a post-geological wilderness. Specialization. In a world where durational development seems to make special fields of understanding more and more necessary, that is to say, since specialization and analysis seem to be necessary and irreversible processes, two parallel events might be indispensable. 1. Each one of us must come to feel in the most tangible, touchable way that he or she is part of an immense creature whose ideal nature is to be conscious of all its parts and therefore can treat each and all of them as particularly sacri. 2. That unless we can put our trust as particles into other particles which partake in the making of such a creature, particles which we know mainly by proxy, we will be in for one catastrophe after the other. Naturally, the burden is on each of us to be worthy of the trust others put on our deeds. That is, of course, what we have been doing all along, with more or less grace, but always with the illusion that eventually omniscience and omnipotence would become the legitimate characteristics of each one of us. Religious creeds encouraged and encourage such hope against hope. Needless to say, it is part of the anguish of the human species to know better, to be more humble. But to be truly humble takes the unlimited ambition of being a truly conscious participatory particula sacra of something whose totality is larger than the sum of its parts. And it can only be so if the sum becomes an integration, a knowledge creation process, an evolution of matter into spirit on the bridge of matter becoming spirit. Arcology. It is therefore an understating of our predicament to say that the future is very uncertain, since we might see the advent of either a technological nemesis or a spiritual genesis. In attempting to forecast a spiritual genesis, I have adopted the term arcology, architecture and ecology. It is an attempt to focus on the city all the major problems of contemporary man. Population, limited land, limited resources, limited energy, limited food production, segregation, pollution, bureaucratization, technological mindlessness, waste, greed, cultural deprivation, and spiritual naught. The archaeological methodology has something very central to offer for the solution of all these problems. It is my contention that the archaeological commitment is a necessary, if not sufficient, step toward a conception and implementation of reality. To put it briefly, by a contraction and greater sophistication of the physical side of man-made reality, equipment, machines, services, utilities, etc., a greater complexity and greater understanding and knowledge are made possible. This in turn can trigger greater spiritual depth in the actions of man and society. Contraction is in the sense of a progression of miniaturization efficiency, so as to achieve more with less. Sophistication is the direction of the above and in the sense of eliminating the enormous extravagance and irrelevance we have constructed around the magic of the machine and the gadget. A stroll through a shopping center will quickly show how unreal the world of affluent man is within the context of a family of man besieged by hunger, poverty, coercion, illness, ignorance, etc. But there's an even more fundamental reason for this unreality. It is the intrinsic spiritual poverty denounced it by such massive surfeit. Research has indicated that the housewife has 140,000 operational items with which to survive happily in the no man's land called the kitchen. Many people strive to do their best to go through the full catalog by direct experience. For this mental dimness we are all responsible and all paying dearly, and at last, not incidentally but coincidentally, we put ourselves where we find ourselves now in an energy bottleneck. The magic word is, needless to say, frugality. Frugality which is not to be found in segregation of spaces, functions, institutions, activities, productivities, bloods, castes, religions, etc., but an integration of them into a truly interactive condition, a condition that can only be found in a city. If the city is to be what is meant to be, the most comprehensive structure for learning, the function of which is a growing understanding guiding man toward a greater sensibility and consequently creativity, then nothing is more urgent for man's destiny than this focusing of his efforts on the transformation of his communities into ecologically oriented cityscapes, those media that have consumed themselves in the messages. Since this new orientation has a spiritual, sacramental undertone, the ecological orientation becomes a theological reality, a theo-ecological thrust. We come full circle, then, where communication as mass media finds reason to exist, because the information caused by it is momentous to the masses, us. They are, that is to say, saturated and quivering with the imponderable, the mysterious, the divine. Thus concludes Architecture as Information, part as Book 5, Sacred Spaces, Section 415, of the Omega Seed by Paolo Soleri. Tomorrow we continue with more sacred spaces. The chapter called Tall Buildings and Gigantism. I will see you then. Alum.